Hello and welcome to Part 2 Gallatin County Planning 101. In this video, we are going to provide information about how planning works in the county, what regulations or plans might apply in certain areas, and how those regulations and plans influence the built landscape. Please note that this video contains general guidance and should be used for informational purposes only. You can refer to the relevant plans and regulations to find specific information when considering developing your own property or changing your current property's primary use, or if you are considering buying a property. The planning department can be contacted with any questions or concerns you may have. Our phone number and email is included at the bottom of this slide. Our contact information is also included on the planning department's homepage. This is the second of a 4-part video series about how land use planning works in Gallatin County. You can check out our website to see video 1, which includes a general overview of the series, and videos 3 and 4, which discuss challenges with our current planning framework and then possible zoning reform options. First, we will provide an overview about how land use planning in the county generally works and what areas of the county are included in our jurisdiction. Perhaps one of the most important things to know about county planning is that we only have jurisdiction in unincorporated areas of Gallatin County. So the cities of Bozeman, Belgrade, Three Forks, Manhattan, and West Yellowstone each have their own planning departments and are responsible for land use planning within their own boundaries. Of note, some municipalities have an extraterritorial planning jurisdiction, otherwise referred to as an ETJ, like Belgrade and Manhattan, shown on the screen here. So in these two images, the light gray areas are those respective cities' ETJs. These are areas outside of incorporated city limits, but within a municipality's statutory authorized planning boundary. So planning applications in the case of Belgrade and Manhattan ETJs are processed by those respective planning offices, but ultimately approved by the Gallatin County Commission. Please note that the information in this video series is only applicable to the unincorporated areas of the county under our jurisdiction. So please contact any of the municipalities or towns listed here to learn more about how planning works in those areas. Montana state law establishes and sets requirements and limitations on the types of tools available for land use planning. The county's planning toolbox includes a mix of regulatory and non-regulatory tools. A non-regulatory planning tool contains general guidance and goals and is meant to guide subdivision review and the development of regulations like zoning, but their content is not directly enforceable. In contrast, a regulatory planning tool contains specific standards that must be adhered to in development design and are often necessary to ensure implementation of the vision described in broader non-regulatory plans. Also of note is that the different types of regulatory standards that may be included in a regulation like zoning can differ from light touch to more in-depth and expansive. We will talk more about these tools later in this video. Public input plays a critical role in the development of both regulatory and non-regulatory tools, as it allows local knowledge and community vision to drive the planning process. Different plans and regulations will apply to a project based on where it is in the county and then the type of development that is proposed. About 74% of private land within the county's planning jurisdiction is not zoned, and about 26% is, so there are no zoning regulations in most of the county. In the portions of the county that are zoned, there are 22 distinct zoning districts that each have their own set of rules, definitions, and permit requirements. The county subdivision regulations, however, apply county-wide, regardless of whether a property is zoned or not, but only come into play when land is proposed to be subdivided into smaller lots. So someone proposing to build a new home in an unzoned area of the county would not need to apply for a permit from the county planning. However, if someone wanted to build a new home in a zoned area, They would likely need to apply for a permit with planning and would have to tailor their design based on the requirements and standards of the zoning regulation. So lack of uniformity in the county's planning framework can be difficult to navigate for current and prospective residents, and also confusing for the public to understand how and when to participate in the public process. It can also be challenging and costly for the county to administer. We will talk more about these difficulties with the county's zoning framework in video 3. Next, we will talk about development review generally and the value of that process. Development review is the process by which the county planning department, the governing body, such as the county commission, and various boards review projects such as a new subdivision or a new building that requires a specific zoning application to ensure compliance with any locally enacted regulatory standards and evaluate any guiding non-regulatory plans that are in place. The development review process exists to protect against potential impacts from a proposed project on neighbors, as well as agriculture, wildlife, public health and safety, and natural resources. During development review, planners will often reach out to different agencies like Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks or the Department of Environmental Quality to solicit input from experts on special topics about the project in terms of the potential impacts relevant to their agency and then options to mitigate those impacts. The governing body also has the ability to attach conditions of approval to most development review applications. So these are conditions that applicants or landowners have to meet and constantly abide by to mitigate the impacts of their project. How a project is reviewed and conversely what is not encompassed in that review will differ depending on the types of planning tools in place that apply to each area, what is being proposed, and the project's location. And we will talk more about the types of regulations that might trigger development review later on in this presentation. Certain types of development review, like subdivisions or certain proposed uses in areas with zoning, provide opportunities for public comment during a public hearing, which creates the opportunity for local knowledge to inform development. If you've ever participated in a public hearing for a development project, it is because there was a regulation in place that required the applicant to go through the public hearing process to receive approval. The information provided during public comment is taken into account by the governing body. On the other hand, there are some types of development review that are done administratively, meaning there is no public hearing and the review is usually done by planners in office in a matter of weeks. For example, the land use permit process is a review that takes place prior to new construction to ensure compliance with standards established in a given zoning regulation, such as density, building height, and property line or watercourse setbacks, and also to ensure compliance with any applicable septic permits, which can help prevent costly sanitation mishaps. Things like building design and aesthetics are generally not included in development review nor addressed by county planning, but we will talk more about the specifics of zoning review later on. Throughout the remainder of this presentation, we will refer to the development review process. So now you know that the information contained in these past two slides are what we are talking about when we use that term. Generally, it's a process to ensure that development meets relevant plans and regulations with some opportunities for public comment during the proposal stage of a project. Next, we will discuss non-regulatory plans in more detail and describe how they can come into play during development review. Non-regulatory plans serve as a compass for new or updated regulations and inform review of some types of permits in zoned areas, and then help to inform subdivisions anywhere in the county. There are certain types of building projects that do not have to address non-regulatory plans, and for example, that would be a new home on an existing lot or a new guest house on an existing lot. Non-regulatory plans provide guidelines to assist developers, planners, and the governing bodies during subdivision review. as these documents provide a vision about what growth and development should look like in the area that they cover. This is especially important in areas without zoning because there are no density guidelines in unzoned areas. And this is something we will talk more about later on. And then because non-regulatory plans usually contain general guidance and information rather than specific numerical standards, there can be broad interpretations of a non-regulatory plan when it comes to the design of subdivisions, which can cause some confusion among the public, staff, advisory boards, and the commission. So, some examples of non-regulatory plans. The growth policy is a good example to start with. This document covers the county as a whole and is directly informed by county residents and includes recommendations to guide growth in a way that provides for community needs while protecting the county's most loved attributes. Neighborhood plans are another good example. These are usually focused in on specific neighborhoods or areas and provide opportunities for communities to make recommendations through the plan that help to guide development patterns at the neighborhood scale. We also have other types of non-regulatory plans in the county that inform things like trail design and transportation, such as the Triangle Trails Plan and the Greater Triangle Area Transportation Plan. As suggested in their names, these plans apply to the Triangle area, which is the area between Bozeman, Belgrade, and Four Corners, rather than the entire county. And each of these planning documents mentioned so far can be found on the county planning website. All right, so now we are going to move on to the various regulatory documents within the county's planning framework. We are going to talk about the three primary types of regulatory documents: the subdivision regulations, the buildings for lease or rent regulations, and zoning. And we will start with the subdivision regulations. So very broadly, the subdivision review process establishes a local review process based on Montana state law for review of proposed divisions of land and to mitigate impacts to the 7 primary criteria, which I will talk about more here in a second. The subdivision regulations, also referred to as the subregs, come into play anytime someone is looking to create a tract of land less than 160 acres in size. There are several instances where someone might be looking to create a tract of land less than 160 acres where a subdivision exemption is applicable, but those situations are nuanced, and if you are interested in learning more about that, please reach out to planning. So let's just say Jane Doe has a 20-acre parcel in Gallatin County, and they want to create 4 5-acre lots from that 20-acre parcel. Jane is required to go through the subdivision review process. During this process, planning would ensure the subregs are being followed as it pertains to the process of subdividing that land, and that the proposal for those new lots complies with the applicable design standards of the subregs. The subdivision review process would also consider whether that 20-acre parcel is zoned. So any subdivision proposal would need to comply with zoning, and would also consider any recommendations of applicable non-regulatory plans, like a neighborhood plan or the county growth policy. And in addition to considering both regulatory and non-regulatory plans, the subdivision review process considers the proposed subdivision's impact on the 7 primary criteria. So, the 7 primary criteria are agriculture, agricultural water user facilities, local services, the natural environment, wildlife, wildlife habitat, and public health and safety. All these are defined in the subdivision regulations, so I would encourage you to go check them out and then give planning a call if you would like to discuss them more. These 7 primary criteria are set by Montana state law, and all subdivisions must be designed so that they do not adversely impact these 7 primary criteria, or that such adverse impacts have been avoided or mitigated to the maximum extent possible. So now you may be wondering what the value of subdivision review is. To start, subdivision review ensures that the impact of creating additional tracts of land has been sufficiently reviewed. And it also ensures the proposal under consideration analyzes its potential impact and minimizes any potential negative impacts on the area it is proposed within. There are numerous requirements of subdivision review. Just to give a couple examples, subdivision review requires that any lots created through this process have public access, that there is sufficient fire protection measures to protect life and property, that future landowners have adequate water supply and sewage disposal, and that the developer has secured necessary permits from other agencies. So not only does subdivision review ensure the mitigation of impacts of the proposal on the area it is proposed within, but it also takes into consideration the needs of future landowners. Also of note, public notice is also provided during the subdivision review process. So the general public and adjacent landowners are required to be notified of the proposal. This includes a notice via mail to all adjacent landowners, and then the proposal is also noticed in the Bozeman Daily Chronicle. Subdivision review with the planning department is divided into 4 stages, more or less. Planning has a document on our website that provides a flowchart of the general subdivision application timeline and process, which we have also linked below in this video description. If you take a look at this flowchart and have questions or would like to learn more, please give us a shout. We would be happy to discuss the intricacies of the process. Within the subdivision process, I do want to highlight in this video here that the 4th stage of subdivision review verifies that all the proposal's necessary infrastructure in the interest of public health and safety has been installed accordingly, meets any required specifications, and then has been verified by any relevant regulatory agencies. Then, if a subdivision falls within a zoning district, future structures within said subdivision would undergo land use permit review with planning. If there is no zoning, future structures within that subdivision would not need any permits from county planning. So it is important to note that once the subdivision has been platted, meaning it's been legally created, planning's future involvement in what is built in that subdivision and the uses of future structures is extremely limited. Subdivision review can get complicated, and there are many different subdivision scenarios depending on where you're at in the county. If you are interested in learning more or have questions, please reach out. We would be happy to discuss this process more with you.
Next, we'll talk about the Buildings for Lease or Rent, or BLR, review process. BLR review is similar to subdivision review in many ways. The BLR regulations apply when a property owner proposes to build 4 or more buildings or units on a parcel and rent them out. So, for example, if someone wants to build 4 individual homes or 4 individual office buildings on a lot and rent them out to different people or entities, that would trigger the BLR review process. If a property owner wanted to build a single apartment building with more than 4 units inside and lease or rent those out, that would also trigger the BLR process. And like subdivision review, BLR review ensures that the proposal under consideration minimizes any negative impacts on surrounding properties and the environment. This review also includes a public hearing process, public notice, and an opportunity for public comment. During the review, the planning department may also analyze compliance with zoning if the property is zoned. So BLR applies whether or not the property is zoned. So to illustrate all of this with an example, let's say Jane wants to build an apartment complex on her property instead of subdividing. Jane would then need to go through all the components of a Buildings for Lease or Rent review to receive approval and construct the building. During this review, planning staff and the county commission will solicit public input and assess the site to ensure that adequate access is planned for Jane's tenants, that the building the tenants will live in has a healthful water and sewer service mechanism, and that they have an adequate fire protection method. After a BLR project has been approved and all the conditions of approval have been met, the property owners must apply for a certificate of compliance, and this allows planning staff to verify that the conditions of approval have been met. The applicant must receive the certificate before the buildings or units can be occupied. So there's a mechanism in place to make sure that the buildings meet all of the conditions of approval placed by the County Commission. Next, we'll talk about zoning. Zoning is different from both the subdivision and BLR process, and we'll explain how. We'll also spend more time talking about zoning than we did BLR and subdivision review. Zoning allows local development and land use to be reviewed by the Planning Department for compliance with locally adopted regulation. The contents of a zoning regulation are created using guiding plans like the growth policy and neighborhood plans, which we discussed earlier. During the creation of a zoning district and this corresponding regulation, there is extensive opportunity for public comment to inform what the zoning looks like and ensure that it reflects the needs of residents. Zoning must also comply with the standards and limitations set by state law. There are two different processes to create a zoning district in Gallatin County. The creation of new zoning districts has typically been initiated by citizens recognizing the need or want to have zoning in their area. We'll talk more about this process in video 3. Zoning regulations can only be applied in areas that are part of a zoning district. So the district defines the geographic area that is subject to the zoning regulation as shown by this image. The zoning regulation itself is the standards that apply in that zoning district. And zoning districts are usually made up of multiple sub-districts to create standards for the different types of land use patterns envisioned for that district. So for example, in this zoning district, we have a rural suburban sub-district, which might account for kind of smaller lots, single-family residential homes, maybe some duplexes. In contrast, the rural residential subdistrict might have lower density standards to kind of create large lots, preserve open space and agricultural uses, whereas the mixed-use subdistrict might allow for both residential and commercial in a more urban type area. And neighborhood commercial, on the other hand, might be more appropriate in a rural area to allow for things like small grocery stores or gas stations. And keep in mind that subdistricts are localized to specific areas and informed by community input, and there are many, many types of possible subdistricts that could be a part of a zoning district. Most zoning regulations typically include a minimum or maximum density requirement, although some zoning regulations have no density requirements. And density standards ensure that no more or no less than a certain number of units are built in a given area. When a property owner wants to subdivide land in a zoned area, they must meet the density requirements of that zoning district in order to proceed through subdivision review. So thinking back to the subdivision process we covered earlier, when an area is not zoned, there are no density requirements placed on a potential subdivision, and a developer could propose whatever density they think is appropriate for that area. We'll talk more about the challenges of having unzoned areas in the county in just a bit. Zoning regulations also typically include a list of permitted land uses, which are permitted by right with minimal or no additional permitting requirements, and a list of conditional uses, which are permitted under certain circumstances and require a public hearing with opportunity for public comment and conditions of approval. Zoning can include property line, water course, and wetland setbacks to ensure new structures are built a certain distance away from these things to reduce impacts to them. Zoning can also include some design standards such as building height limitations and lighting requirements to help keep skies dark. Some zoning regulations in steep mountainous areas also include standards to ensure that steep slopes and ridgelines are not built on, or if they are built on, include standards to prevent erosion and preserve viewsheds. A violation of zoning can be enforced at the county level and corrected by working with a compliance officer. And that process is typically complaint-driven, so we do not have a compliance officer out looking around the county, peering over fences, looking for violations. It's all complaint-driven. Importantly, the content of zoning can vary greatly in scope and depth. Zoning regulations can be on the light touch side, with minimal permitting requirements, a broad range of uses permitted, and only account for the most basic public health and safety impacts or most pressing community needs. Conversely, zoning regulations can be more robust and require permits for most types of construction, allow some uses as conditional uses, which, as we discussed, requires a public hearing, and a more robust zoning regulation can account for additional details of construction design, such as building height, parking requirements, and more. There are also a range of zoning types in between light touch and robust, and whether a new zoning regulation is more on the light touch side or more robust or something in between can be decided upon during the public feedback process when a new zoning regulation and district are created. The value of zoning is that it provides predictability about what uses can occur in certain areas. So when you buy a property in a zoned area, you know what can and can't be located in your neighborhood or the general area. So this can prevent a high intensity industrial use, like a factory, from occurring next to a residential area, for example. Zoning is also valuable to property owners because it provides a review process where planners can catch problems with a potential construction plan before it is built. So, for example, if a property owner owns a parcel in the floodplain and is planning to build in the floodplain, a planning review could catch that and redirect the property owner to build somewhere on their parcel that's outside of the floodplain and therefore reduce their risk of flooding. Zoning also provides some assurances to prospective purchasers or users of a property that if the previous landowner applied for and received a zoning land use permit, that a third-party review for compliance with health, safety, and design standards has taken place, so that information is able to be transferred through that land use permit, and there's a record of that information that can be passed on. Also, as we discussed earlier, when certain uses are classified as conditional, it creates a process for neighbors of proposed developments to weigh in on a certain land use and inform the conditions of approval that are placed on that use, and also influence approval or denial of that use. There are several challenges of not having zoning, so in unzoned areas, many types of development can take place with minimal local review. So this means that there are no mechanisms or processes in place to ensure that new construction complies with any standards intended to reduce traffic, noise, and concentrated populations in areas without services like water and sewer services or fire protection. There's also no mechanism for the county to deny new uses or construction in unzoned areas, and no public comment opportunity on development projects unless they trigger subdivision or BLR review. So, for example, in a residential area that is unzoned, someone could propose a land use that would be concerning to most of the area's landowners. Maybe something like a motocross track, a meat processing plant, a car crushing plant, or even a theme park. And there is no mechanism to hold a public hearing about the use or project, or for the county to deny or even review that kind of use or construction because there's no zoning. This is not to say that any of these types of land uses are inherently bad, but they come with impacts that can be difficult to manage or live next to in a residential area, for example. The benefit of zoning is that where these types of uses are appropriate is planned for in advance through a public process, so that residents and prospective landowners know where these types of uses or construction are designated, and their impacts can be accounted for through development review. This is just an overview of some of the challenges with no zoning. In part 3 of this video series, we will provide greater detail about the other challenges associated with having unzoned areas. So these graphics illustrate the points that I just went over. So on the left side of the screen, this image shows an area that is zoned. So here we've got predictable land use patterns. We've got in the background there agricultural land use. And this area, since there's wildlife nearby, we can see there's a deer in the background there, has got standards in place for wildlife-friendly fencing and low-density cluster standards to make sure that homes are grouped together and that wildlife can pass through this area. So that ensures that wildlife can move around as they need to and reduce wildlife vehicle collisions. And then in the foreground, we've got residential uses grouped together. We've got a church there, so zoning here shows a predictable land use patterns where we've got similar uses grouped together. And then on the right side of the screen, this area has no zoning, so we've got an unpredictable land use pattern. So we've got a factory, a church, a theme park, and agriculture kind of mixed throughout there. So that kind of makes it hard for these folks to be neighbors with one another because their land uses are so different. And because there's no zoning here, there is no way to prevent these sort of different uses from winding up as neighbors. And the deer in the background, since there's no zoning, there's no wildlife friendly fencing standards, there's no cluster development standards, and nobody to review any type of impacts that might be happening to the wildlife in this area because it's not zoned. So overall, on the right side there, we've got kind of a more haphazard land use pattern, and on the left, we've got a more predictable one, and that's because of zoning. So we've talked a lot about zoning in this presentation, so now we'll just sum up by going over what county zoning is and what it's not. So county zoning is only applicable in unincorporated areas that are part of a zoning district. County zoning is not applicable to municipalities like Bozeman or Belgrade, and it has nothing to do with HOA management or the rules that HOAs might have. Zoning is in place to protect public health and safety, wildlife, water, and the environment. It does not usually include architectural standards, things like house color, roofing materials, or overall home design standards. Zoning is developed upon the growth policy and other non-regulatory documents to create predictable land use patterns. It is not an arbitrary restriction of property rights. All of the contents of a zoning regulation are influenced through the public process and tied back to guiding plans like the growth policy. Zoning is adaptable to the county's unique areas. As we saw with the subdistrict example, a zoning regulation or a zoning district can be made up of multiple subdistricts to account for different types of land use patterns that might be appropriate in a urban versus a rural area, for example. County zoning does not include any blanket standards or a single unizone, any type of blanket regulation that applies broadly throughout the county. Zoning is always tailored based off of the county's unique geographic features and influenced by the public process. Zoning is applicable to uses and development that occur after its adoption, so any uses or development that's in place prior to zoning adoption are not eliminated, they're not illegal, they're sort of grandfathered in. So now, a couple more slides. I've got a summary of what we've learned about regulatory documents in the county. So to rehash this a little bit, subdivision applies to divisions of land. The review includes analysis of access, water and sewer, fire protection, environmental and agricultural impacts, and much more. But there are no specific density, building design, or land use standards included in the subdivision regulations. Buildings for lease or rent applies to the rent or lease of 4 or more buildings or units on a parcel. And the review is sort of similar to subdivision review in that it includes review for access, water and sewer, fire protection, etc. And again, just like subdivision, there's no specific density, building design, or land use standards included in BLR review. Zoning, on the other hand, applies to new construction and land use change in areas that are zoned, and it includes review for compliance with the standards that are within that zoning district. So that could include things like density, some elements of building design, and land use standards. And all 3 of these types of regulations utilize community input in their development and guiding plans like the growth policy, and all are meant to help protect the public and the environment. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. We hope that you stay informed and engaged with the planning department and the county overall. There's always something interesting going on to stay aware of. I've got the various social media accounts that the county participates in on this screen. If you're not someone who is very tech savvy, there's also legal notices posted in the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, both the print version and the online version, and you can look for county happenings there. You can also get our emailed newsletter, and of course, we'd always be happy to talk to you in person. You can swing by the office, the courthouse on Main Street, or send us an email or give us a call. And also a reminder to watch the next videos in the series, parts 3 and 4. 3 will talk about challenges with our planning framework, and 4 will talk about possibilities for zoning reform. Thanks so much.